Hey buddy, welcome back to another episode of How AI is Built. Today we have a very special guest. John Wessel is the founder of Agreeable Data and my go-to guy for data orchestration. If you're drowning in a sea of data orchestration tools and you're really overwhelmed by which tools to consider and how to make the right choice, this is the conversation for you. John and I try to cut through the noise to guide you towards the right orchestrator for your needs.
It is an evolution of a task scheduler. So way back in the day, if you're using Windows had, I think it was just called Task Scheduler. And then if you're using Linux, there's something called cron. And the very basics of it is you would have some kind of job, arbitrary code that would run, and you would schedule it and it would run. That's the very simple starting point. And then over time, it evolved, especially the last few years, into allowing for a lot more complexity. And that's kind of where the modern orchestration tools pick up.
Nice. And what was like the OG data orchestrator that like really took the industry by storm, or who had like the first real market share?
Yeah, I mean, I think Airflow right now, before Airflow, I don't know that there was a ton of market other than people were doing their own thing. But the modern era, definitely Airflow took the market share. A lot of people running it themselves, and I think that's changing now. It is extremely crowded right now. Like one of the main problems, like we'll get into this, is like, what do I pick? There's so many options.
And since you're already in like a while in the data space, is it like going through cycles where it's actually like a huge number of tools popping up and then basically it goes back to like it singles down to like a few depending on the use case? Or is it like a constant there is like too much on the market?
In my opinion, it's just constant. It's like people are launching new orchestrators every day. This is a funny one. This was like 2 weeks ago. Somebody launched an orchestrator that was like a meta-orchestrator. So it's like orchestrating orchestrators. So it's a little bit out of control. But to the point though, like people recognize the need and that's why it's so crazy right now.
What would you say like the key problem it is that the orchestrator solves or the need it actually fulfills?
So the innovation that sparked the craze, I would say, would be the DAG. A DAG, most simply, is you had task orchestrators that were just like linear, like start this thing at this time. Like that's basically what they did. And the DAG introduced two other components. Like I always mess this up. It's directed acyclic graph is what DAG means, or direct acyclic graph. But direct is like there's a start and there's a finish. And the acyclic is there's no loops, is simply what that means. And then the graph is you've got dependencies. So that was the start to the Airflow and the Dagster or Dag Prefect, and there's a lot of others in that space. But that was the thing that people knew that like, oh, well, I have this task, but I need this other thing to run too. And if this one fails, and I don't want to run this one. So those are those complex dependencies, and avoiding, loops was, I think, the next what spawned the DAG, and then the DAG architecture spawned all the new orchestrators.
Yeah. What do you say is like the place where like an organization or development team actually like starts to need an orchestration tool? Like what are like the identifiers or characteristics of a use case where you actually need to get into that stuff?
Yeah, so one of the things I kind of focus on is modernization efforts. So I love Greenfield just as much as the next person, but I've just done most of my work in modernization efforts. And there's a couple simple vectors. One is just volume. So if you're running hundreds of tasks or jobs, that could be a hint. Two is complexity. And that's just like, okay, I need this to run and this needs to wait for this. And then these two things need to wait for this other thing. So that level of complexity, like those are the two things I would look for. And honestly, if you don't have that, I wouldn't be embarrassed about just using something simple to schedule a task. If you have simple tasks that need to be run, like I do a lot of work with Snowflake. Snowflake has a little task scheduler now. And I have a client where they have one thing that right now, they're a startup. They have one thing that needs to run. It's a Snowflake task, and that's totally fine. But once you get to the number and the complexities, where you should definitely look into some kind of workflow orchestrator.
And you already mentioned the dependencies. Like, can you help us out, like, a little bit imagining, like, what it actually is? Like, each node basically is a task you have to execute, like a script, a SQL command, and each node basically pipes from each other. But how is actually, like, for example, like, how is the data flowing? How are the different nodes executed and when, and how you actually define the different steps?
So a lot of these, let's see, the Airflow, Dagster, and Prefect are all Python based. So Python is kind of the winner in this space. There's a few that are non-Python based. But as far as the flow, let me just think of a practical example. So say you're using Dagster and you want to have an ETL type pipeline or ELT type pipeline. So maybe you're extracting from a source database like an Oracle or SQL Server or something, and you want to get data into a Databricks, Snowflake, BigQuery, something like that. And then in the middle, let's say you want to run dbt and run some transformations as well. The key point here is you want something up here that says like, well, oh, SQL server's down, and then the data isn't flowing, or like, oh, this dbt transformation failed. Like, you want something that is orchestrating all those pieces, whereas if you just have them all separate, where it's like, all right, dbt runs here and some ETL thing runs here, and maybe you have some other components to it, you don't have a single orchestrator. They're all separate. The errors happen separately. So some of it is actually the visibility aspect and the observability aspect of it, not just the fact that you can kind of do the dependencies.
Yeah. And you already mentioned you have like a source system and a destination system. When I imagine it, like stuff like dbt, okay, it automatically runs mostly like in the database. But when I'm thinking about like a Python script, I'm loading the data and then I'm doing like some computations, but then I have to push the data somewhere else. So you always tend to have like a destination for like every task you're doing.
Right.
And how do you mostly set it up, especially if you have like different transformation steps? And most of the time you aren't executing them in your source database, but you have to have something in between. How do you actually orchestrate this, and what is the underlying infrastructure for it?
There's a lot of flexibility. Like, one of the things I actually really love that we're moving to is a lot of these orchestrators started out as open source tools, so people would run them in Docker, Kubernetes, or whatever. But a lot of them are moving to be cloud managed. So Astronomer for Airflow, Dagster Cloud for Dagster, Prefect has an offering too. But several of them, I know this is true of Dagster, I think it's true of a couple of the others as well, is they have this cloud control plane module where you have that, you log into an interface, and then you can deploy resources inside AWS, GCP, Azure to execute whatever you're doing, which can lessen the burden with a lot of the security requirements people have to deal with. So I like that model. To better answer your question, I think I always pick serverless if I can, like a Lambda or, the Azure GCP equivalent for that. I think those are great, and I would use them. Even GitHub Actions, I'm using GitLab runners with a client, and they actually just needed something simple. So we're just using task scheduling and GitLab to orchestrate for now. We'll probably move to Dagster after it gets more complex. But I would say serverless as long as possible, and then, probably have to get into something like Kubernetes as it gets more complex.
And if you would have to break down like a data orchestrator and like the main components you work with, what would your like main components on a more abstract level be?
What do you mean by main components?
So basically, if you have like a use case at hand and you basically have to break it down, how do you actually think about it from a data orchestration lens?
Oh, okay. Yeah. We talked ETL. Let's say you wanted to do, you've got some kind of Python script that does enrichment. Say you're collecting data from a website, and you've got a Python script that does enrichment, does an IP lookup, and gets a location, something like that. Which that particular use case, there's actually a lot of out of the box tools that do that. So maybe it's a bad example. But I would say breaking it down into the components of like, okay, again, how complex is this going to be? What are the requirements as far as memory? Because if you're doing serverless, you've got a time limit and a memory limit, practical memory limit. So that'd be one piece. I think for like AI, right, which a lot of people are building or attempting to build AI pipelines, that would be something that you'd really want to understand the memory and time requirements, because that could be something you could run up into to issues with the serverless functions.
Yeah. And since you already mentioned it, how do you think like AI fits best into the data orchestration? Because more and more steps are stuff like embedding calculations, tagging of the data at different classifications. Do you just slap like a GPU on the serverless function or on Kubernetes? Or do you rather prefer to deploy the like AI stuff separately and just call it from a script?
Yeah, I haven't done a ton with AI and pipelines, but the thing that I've noticed is there's a whole nother class of tools being developed for that, like LangChain, for example, which not a huge fan. I think we talked about this, yeah. So I think that's the challenge. Like to me, the orchestration tools we've been talking about are the best orchestration tools, regardless of the workload, and that's what I would pick. But with AI, like you said, I mean, depending on what it is, like I mentioned, Dagster with a VM or a container deployed in your environment, like that's an option. Like if you want to, like deploy a VM, size it to what you need it, and run workload on it. For AI, you could do that. Obviously, Kubernetes is probably more cost efficient. But those are the types of things that, if you need GPU for your workload, that I think I would do versus like getting into the like AI specific orchestration tools, because I think I'm not super deep in them, but from what I've seen, they're basically the same thing, but less mature. So yeah,
Yeah.
hot take.
The good take. And if you're looking at like you're starting a new project, like modernization or new use case, how do you actually think about like choosing between the different orchestrators like Luigi, Prefect, Airflow, Dagster, and whatever? And do you even restrict it to like a subset of those because the space is too large?
Yeah, there's so many, and because Airflow was the leader, and pretty much people used Airflow. Luigi's older too, actually. Like Luigi's been around a while too. So you have just had a couple, and like I would say originally, like okay, if you're doing something really complex and really you want high extensibility, all that stuff, like use Airflow. Everybody was kind of there, and then Luigi was nice, like oh, I'm doing a small project, or like I love it's a little bit more simple. I love it's very Pythonic. I think those were some of the pluses with that one, or just a big Spotify fan, I guess could be another thing. But I mean, now you've got the complexity, simplicity scale, and then you have the use case scale going the other way of like, so Mage is one, Mage.ai is one that's very like data pipeline, data engineering focused. Like I pretty deeply evaluated that one for a client, didn't end up going that direction. But I would say that would be one to check out if you're kind of a data engineer team of one and you're kind of getting started on something. They seem to have a lot of velocity, doing some neat stuff in the data engineering space. And then Airflow, I mean, it's still a contender. There's a lot of noise about like, this is an Airflow killer, this is an Airflow killer, It's going to be around. And I think once you get to certain sizes, it's an ecosystem thing because Airflow has a lot of integrations with various tooling, and there's all these tools being built in the ecosystem around it. Like, just like I mentioned, I want to use my orchestrator to execute DBT, or I want to use it to do some kind of ETL thing. So I guess if use case specific data engineering, small team, Mage might be a good one. I've liked Dagster a lot. Like that's what I've ended up going to. I've got a client moving to that, probably another one moving to that. Make sure you solve your problem first. And the orchestration piece, like orchestrators are not typically part of an MVP. Let's just say it that way. And I think it's easy for me and probably for a lot of us to get excited about new tools and new things and to jump fully into new orchestrator, a new way of doing things when, make sure you stay focused on solving that initial use case, and the orchestrator is kind of the thing that comes alongside to help scale.
Yeah, I think like until your system breaks through like the sheer load it has to handle, until then you're probably better off going without an orchestrator, and then you can start thinking about switching or making your system like even more efficient. And if you had to choose one, like for personal projects, if you're just building some stuff for fun, which has to be performant, which one would you go with?
Dagster. You see, it had to be performant. If I was doing something for fun, just with like data, I'd probably use Mage just for fun. But if I needed that, like really want this to be performant, and then Dagster has a big enough ecosystem to where, it's got some nice features from an ecosystem perspective. And that's the other trouble is there's some really good ones out there. Even Luigi is a cool one that the ecosystem just not quite as big for whatever reason, that I might pick one that I think has a little bit bigger ecosystem just for the integrations extensibility stuff.
Yeah, I think like Airflow from a given size that your data team and your company is, for one, it's like it's an advantage because most data engineers probably know it. but also you aren't restricted to a company. And I think like especially like Dagster, like okay, it's like open sourced or partly open sourced, but
Yeah, it is.
it's still mostly linked to the company. And I think like Airflow, since it's completely attached, it has like some advantages. But I'm also always thinking about, is it still in use just because like most of the talent actually grew up working in Airflow, or just because it's actually like the best tool for the job?
Yeah. The feedback I get is that people like the Dagster developer experience better between the two, but more people know Airflow. The open source situation is better because we all know what happens when open source companies raise money. It's the same story every time. I mean, no matter what the motivations are, like they're accountable to investors now, right? Not Dagster is a great tool, but Airflow does have that advantage. They have the head start, the developer ecosystem is still strong. And honestly, now that you can use Astronomer and these other hosted things, like that takes away a lot of the headache for people. And I think because of that, it's going to be around for a long time.
Are there managed Dagsters on like the big cloud providers like AWS and GCP?
I haven't seen any. That doesn't mean there's not, but I haven't seen any. And I think Dagster using their like hybrid cloud deploy model wants to use that model versus the, managed inside of a GCP or Azure from a business model perspective. I think that's the route they're taking.
Yeah, it's just like as a developer in Europe, it always gives me a headache if I have to consider another cloud provider who is sitting also in the other stuff just because of data security.
Yeah, GDPR and the residency stuff. Is that curious from your perspective? Like, how does that influence your decisions with tooling in general, as far as that data residency stuff?
So first, it's always easiest to build on a single cloud because I can control the regions easily, which I can do in multi-cloud as well. But often it's a little bit trickier. And what I'm often thinking about is like, to whom am I handing it over? So on the one side, we have like all the GDPR stuff, which we have to consider. So most of the stuff isn't allowed to leave Europe, which so many different providers do not really guarantee. I think like Microsoft is the only one who does like really strong guarantees to help you with that. And that's why like Microsoft is the cloud we see used most often, especially like in Germany and in Europe, because they're selling to compliance departments, and especially for bigger companies, they are making the purchasing decisions. AWS is a good option for that, but it doesn't make it so easy on the developer side to control all of that. I think GCP makes it a little bit easier to control the VPCs because you have to make it explicit. In AWS, usually the VPC is automatically set, which makes it a little bit more confusing in my opinion. In general, in data orchestration, since you are using already so many different services, especially from an AI perspective, you have to be really careful. And this is something where I actually try to avoid another provider if I can, because then I don't really have to deal with their departments. Like, is my data leaving Europe? Is it in the data centers you actually give it to? Because I have to make the assurances in here. And that's also why I think we are seeing like a big trend towards Microsoft and Azure, because everyone now wants to use GPT-4, and like only the GPT-4 hosted on Microsoft is GDPR compliant.
Interesting. That makes sense.
And not to get like off board too far, we've already talked about like the deploying the different nodes in the end, like where the tasks are executed. We talked before about like the issues with Orchestrator in the deployments, that no solution is perfect. Can you maybe walk through like the different downsides and advantages of like serverless, of Kubernetes, and whatever else you can deploy it with?
So the first decision is managed or non-managed, right? Like, do you want to manage your own Airflow instance or Dagster, or use Dagster Cloud or Astronomer? So, I mean, that's the first decision. I find that teams that don't have to manage it usually don't want to, but there are tons of, like, I mean, you just mentioned GDPR. There are tons of instances where the team doesn't have a choice. Like working with a client using a tool called Meltano for ETL, and people like, oh, there's lots of cloud hosted ETL. You just click a button and it works. And it's like, well, all the data has to stay inside their private cloud. They've got a host of different servers. Some of them are actually on premise at site locations. And that was the right tool for that situation, and we could self-host and stuff. So, I mean, I think that's the first question, is managed versus non-managed. And then from there, I don't know. It's developer experience, complexity of task. I think, again, my experience has been that Dagster has one of the better developer experiences, but it's not as extensive as like an Airflow. Prefect, I think, also is one that people like the developer experience, but it's not quite as, again, extensive as Airflow. And to be honest, one of my complaints, which we kind of started out with, is like, this isn't sustainable. Like, there can't be this many Pythonic DAG based orchestrators. Like, somebody's going to have to win. So I think that's what always gives me the most like internal conflict is like, am I going to pick a loser here? Like, I don't want to say they're basically the same, but they're basically the same in a sense. And I just don't know that I see all of them surviving unless I guess they figure out some kind of niches or evolve in different directions. But we're not even talking about one's written in Java and one's written in Python. Like the top ones, they're all Python. So that's a challenge. And it's something I always think about. Is this going to be around in 5 years? Because I'm doing a lot of work here. I don't want to have to migrate off of it.
Yeah. And for you, we already talked like about the memory and time-limited issues. What are like some stuff you actually lose, like some hacks or tricks to actually like push off the memory and time issues as far as you can?
Yeah, optimization, of course. If you're querying a database, optimize the query. If you're querying a database that's scalable, look at scaling the database up. So, things like that. Like if you've got dependencies around it where you can set the max scale limit to just eke out a little bit more for when that thing is running, right? Because a lot of these are jobs that maybe don't run that often. And you could set a max auto scale to just slightly higher and just get a little bit more out of it and buy yourself some more time. And then, of course, if you're running some kind of queries, can optimize queries for efficiency. If it's traditional database, add indexes, things like that. If it's an API, maybe a little bit less that you can do, but contact your neighborhood developer and ask them to make it faster. I don't know.
Yeah, and in the like past few months, I really fell in love with stuff like polars, especially like on top of like Delta Lake or Iceberg, because you can shift like so much of the like computation and stuff like that and the querying like down to the database, and through like smart partitioning, like optimization of the database and splitting it up actually smarter and like all the query optimizations you can do, like limiting large joins, the tall table first, then filtering it down with a where clause, like using like the in-SQL one to actually like reduce the memory issues. What I also often come into doing is like because I try to avoid orchestrators at the moment for some stuff that I'm building, I'm logging like times and memories. And since it's different for like different requests you're actually doing, but it's like predictable how much it is approximately, I try to batch them together in a way where they actually fit into memory. And this is also like a smart hack if you can do. And if you don't use an orchestrator for like scheduling, but using like a script to do it, you can implement like some fun logic.
But I mean, another thing on that is make sure you have some kind of monitoring tool set up so like, especially if you've got a lot going on, like almost always the first thing I do is set up monitoring alerting on existing stuff. Number one, because if I'm doing modernization efforts, I'm going to break something at some point. Number two is often like you can like right size things for resources. And I'm talking like a Datadog type of thing, Datadog or whatever your favorite monitoring tool is. And that, again, like it's just such a great place to start because it forces discoverability. Like you have to go through and like find all the things to monitor. It forces you, like when you want to optimize for things like, okay, I've got 7 days, 14 days, 30 days of history. I can actually have data to work on to do this effort. Or like you were saying, like getting the scheduling, optimized, like you actually have data around that in an easy to discover place. So I've always found that a helpful place to start projects in general.
And since we are already there, you mentioned, like when we talked before, that people mostly pick based on the most difficult workloads they have, which often is like an outlier and a bad approach. Can you elaborate a little bit and maybe give like an example for that? And also how you would solve it and how you would approach stuff like that.
Yeah, so I totally understand this desire, but there's a really strong desire for a lot of people to do everything together in like one tool or in the least tools possible and single pane of glass, like that type of thing. I totally understand that. but that can be a pretty expensive approach. So here's an example. So say you have several dozen, maybe even 100 data pipeline jobs, basically ETL, ELT type jobs. And then you have one ML job. So those are like your data things. I actually have a client right now, like exact scenario. They've got tons of data movement jobs. They're just doing some ML stuff. And they had everything deployed together in the same environment. And they're spending a lot of money, frankly. So what we did is we split it up. We moved almost all the data movement jobs to Fivetran, which is not typically a cheap option, right? Like Fivetran gets expensive. But for them, it wasn't actually that much data. So we're talking Fivetran bill of like a couple $100. There's not a ton of data for what they needed. And then this ML job, which was also deployed in the same environment, was like, okay, like this doesn't need to be in the same environment. Like we can use something like, we decided on Google Vertex AI to deploy the model. So we moved that, that's deployed there. And then we've got our kind of ETL jobs in the other environment. But we just made that decision of like, all right, these are grouped together. And then we've got this one outlier. The ML is what actually needs the extra resources, and we want an API on top of it and things like that. The rest of it is just ETL jobs. And there was the temptation like, all right, like we need something that does all of this. When really you need like two things, this and then the one outlier. And again, I mean, there's a downside where you've got more things to manage, but I don't know. I think that's what you sign up for if you're in technology, my opinion on it.
Yeah. And it's getting easier, especially like managing ML stuff. If you just have one component, I wouldn't deploy it myself. I would use something with auto scaling where I don't
Yeah,
really have to worry about
definitely.
like stuff like base 10, for example, or any scale, which just helps out greatly. Because in the end, what most people really don't realize, like MLOps, it's a huge pain in the ass, especially if you're talking about larger workload and larger models, because you have to kind of predict like what is the load I'm expecting in the system, and it's always off, and it can really break the bank if you have like really like spikes in usage suddenly. So in orchestration, what would you say, what's like missing in the space? What would you love to see built on top of or next to the orchestration tools?
So the thing that's missing is a clear winner, honestly. Like that's the big thing that's missing in my opinion. As far as what would I love to see built, honestly, I would love kind of the opposite. I would love for product people to get more involved in the orchestration space and take some things away. It's a very technical space with very technical users. I don't know, there's a trend to feature. The products suffer after it can do a million different things and integrate with a million different things. So yeah, my number one wish would be product people getting their hands more deeply in some of these things. And then number two, like in all seriousness, I'd love to see more deep integrations in the space in general with like Terraform type. There absolutely you can use Terraform with Airflow and et cetera, but there's still more there with kind of DevOps piece of it that I'd love to see evolve, especially with things like dbt and Snowflake and some of the newer ones like Mage. I'd love to see that mature. We can just have that repeatability that the infrastructure as code provides.
Yeah, but even like the CI/CD and Terraform aren't the like best integrated most of the time.
Sure.
So like going into orchestration should be even worse.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's wishful thinking for sure. So yeah, maybe Terraform's not the right person to do it, but some sort of like further development. I mean, because the thing is, like developers or engineers in general are just still so far ahead of a lot of people in the data space. And there's overlap, right? There's absolutely engineers that like move into data, and then there's like analyst types that move into engineering. But just the data space from a maturity level is just still behind engineers as far as a lot of tooling and orchestration, even version control. I mean, people don't understand. So DBT is what, like 5 years old, maybe? Like DBT does a lot of cool things, but one of the main things that does is data teams use Git now. They didn't before, pretty much. Which, I mean, when did developers start using version control? I mean, many years before that. So I think there's still like some immaturity in the space. that can be filled in for just pick a practice like infrastructure as code. You could pick that as a practice that could be applied. You could pick CI/CD as a practice that could be better applied in this like data movement, data orchestration space. So there's plenty to do for sure.
And since you're working in Python scripts anyhow, you could also just slap your SQL commands in like a separate file, and you would also already have version control, so you don't even need DBT.
True, yeah.
So there are some little wins. I want to catch up on something you mentioned earlier. I think like Dagster is the tool you're at the moment most familiar with. What is the feature you would kill in Dagster?
The one that I really wanted was that cloud control plane, which it's newer. I played with it a little bit, so I'll probably have a better critique if we catch up again sometime. But that is the model that not many people have done. And I think it's probably beneficial, especially like when the GDPR instance, because most of these, like when these things become SaaSified from open source, it's like, okay, now use our open source tool. And with data residency, security, all those things, like that's the thing I haven't seen as many people do is cloud control plane with like deployed agents. So that's the one that was like on my list. It's like, oh, like somebody's doing it, but I haven't spent enough time with it to give you a nice critique of it. So I'll just have to let you know on that one.
Well, what's an interesting example for that one? I think is Onyxia with a Y for instead of an I in the first one. And they are basically also like, they are connecting like different backend technologies and making it easy for data scientists to deploy them on different clouds. And they're doing that in a front end. It's an open source tool by the like French Institute of something. Pretty surprisingly, it works really good. It's really interesting. Something you can check out.
Yeah, I'll check that out.
Great. What's the technology you're most excited about outside of data orchestration?
Can I answer this with anything other than generative AI, right? Like, is that...
I hope so.
Is that even acceptable? All right, good. No, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of cool stuff with that. But the thing I've been dying to try is actually the Apple VR stuff. I think that's really interesting. I have a friend who was telling me, he's like, look, so one of his friends got early access to it and said that he switched his entire workload. Like he put it on and he just works with it on all day. Like that's his new like productivity thing, which seems crazy to me. Like I can't picture it. He said he's been doing it for, well, last time I talked to him, I'll have to catch up with him again, but said he's been doing it for several weeks now. And like, that's what he uses it all day as a developer. It's wild. I don't know.
It seems crazy, but he for sure saves money on screens.
Yeah. Nothing else. Yeah.
Nice. So where can people follow along with you, your company, and also get in touch with you when they have like data orchestration or data needs in general?
Yeah, so agreeabledata.com is the website. You can also find us on LinkedIn, Agreeable Data on LinkedIn, and then my LinkedIn, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, John Wessel.